Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
All too often, young people in our country have been let down, not given access to the right opportunities or training in their community. And that's created an over-reliance in our economy on higher and higher levels of migration. As a system, it cannot be right that some people don't get to feel the pride of making a contribution, the dignity of work.
That was Keir Starmer speaking last month to business leaders at the Farnborough Air Show. Today, we've had the latest figures on migration into the UK, bringing the issue back to the forefront of politics. Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock. And Stephen, I think some of our listeners would be forgiven for thinking we're stuck here in a loop. New data is out. The British public are very concerned about whether the government can control migration. And we've got a Prime Minister giving a stern sort of wording on that he can get a grip on the issue. It reminds me very much of the Rwanda debate we've had. And YouGov polling puts this as a hot button issue, migration that is, for going back years. It's down from a peak in surveys from before the Brexit referendum. But then something that is different about the conversation we're going to have today is the recent far-right riots we've had in the UK, which were driven by this strong anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker rhetoric. And so while the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, wants to focus on skills and the economy and training British workers for the jobs of the future, he's also going to be asked questions about the numbers of both legal and illegal migrants coming into the UK.
We're going to get into a discussion about immigration and public attitudes and the economy in a moment, plus the conflation of many politicians of regular and irregular migration, often referred to as legal and illegal migration. Let's first bring you a couple of headlines from the latest official stats we have out on this today. So in the year ending June 2024, almost 1.2 million visas were granted by the UK for work, study or family reasons. Just under half of those were work visas. Those numbers down 11% on last year, but still over double 2019 levels. Study visas were another big part of that issue as well. They came down too on the year-on-year numbers. In the same period, just under 39,000 people were detected arriving in the UK by irregular routes. That's a number also down 26% from the previous year. 81% of what the official stats term as irregular arrivals were via small boats, and that number also down 29% on the previous year.
So that's the data. Now let's talk about both it and the conversations it starts, just by sort of the nature of the political situation we find ourselves in. Joining us now is Ben Brindle, the researcher at the Migration Observatory. Ben, I just want to start off by, before we sort of dig into the flows of people coming to the UK, you follow this far more closely than we do. Why do you think migration has become such a salient, such a closely watched issue again?
Well, there are a whole range of reasons for that, really. It's quite difficult to sort of pinpoint sort of one thing. Migration has an impact not just economically, but also socially as well. And people's priorities and perspectives differ. And naturally, that means that the way people view migration is going to differ as well. I do think, though, while saying that, it's important to put things into context. As you alluded to a moment ago, the extent to which people are opposed to migration, that sort of opposition has softened when we compare sort of recent data to data from sort of the mid-2010s, and also the salience, the extent to which people think migration is an important topic. Also, those sort of attitudes have softened as well. There's been a slight ticking up in sort of the past year or so, but yeah, certainly when we compare recent data to the mid-2010s, it appears that the opposition has softened.
And when we look at the numbers of people that have entered the UK, and we gave some of the statistics there as well, on most measures it's down year on year. Now that's after a peak that we'd seen, and we did talk about it at the time as well, that was partly driven by people who were getting visas who were leaving Hong Kong, a lot of people coming from Ukraine as well. They were special scenarios that had increased the net migration figures. Is the overall trend down, or is this just a correction of what we'd seen in previous years?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. In one sense, it is something of a return to normality. So, for example, following the pandemic, there was a sharp rise in student immigration to the UK, a variety of reasons for that. But we expected as time progressed that this big student immigration would translate into big student emigration, so students leaving the UK, in good part because the majority of students only tend to stay in the UK for a few years. So some of this is sort of, a return to normality, as I say. But at the same time, there have been some policy changes made by the previous government, the Conservative government, which came into force sort of in the early months of this year. And the jury's still out on how much of an impact they are going to have. But it does look like they are going to reduce levels of migration going forward. And that's part of what we see in the picture today from the Home Office visa stats.
I think one of the difficulties for any government, be they Labour, Conservative or other, trying to kind of be seen to have a grip on this issue is it doesn't seem like there's a clear link between public concern and where the numbers are. I mean, Ben, is it as simple as higher net or illegal migration goes up and so does public anger?
I think it's really interesting when you dig into the numbers on public attitudes and look in a bit more depth. So in opinion surveys, when the public are asked, would you like to see levels of migration come down? There is majority support for that. But then if you ask about specific groups, so you can ask about different types of workers, for example, care workers, or also sort of a bit more widely, so say Ukrainians or international students, groups like this. For most of those specific groups, the public would actually like more migration of those types. So you sort of have this strange picture where people would like less migration overall, but would like more migration of the components which make up that overall number.
So how do we explain that? Is it that people are listening to politicians who are instrumentalising the figures in all sorts of ways to their own political ends? Or is it just that people haven't thought through what the actual implication of having fewer people coming into the country actually means?
I think it's a mix of sort of different things, in terms of the statements that politicians make. It's not just those statements shaping public opinion, but it works the other way as well. So, politicians will try and represent parts of the electorate. So that's sort of a two-way street. And I mean, there are groups that public would like to see less migration of. Sort of bankers is one group when it comes to occupations, and then also people coming across the channel on small boats. People would like to see those figures reduce as well. So I think that the two views, while sort of slightly inconsistent, it's possible to see why people can hold both of those views at the same time.
I think the reason why we started this way is because we now want to talk to you about what the policy levers Labour are doing. Based on sort of what you said about politicians try and represent the constituencies they're trying to win over, what do you view Labour's approach? What kind of policies are they trying to achieve with what they're doing? Are they trying to get down illegal migration or boost net migration? What is the kind of goal based on what they're doing?
So on both regular or legal migration and on irregular migration, the Labour Party would like numbers to come down. And this is quite similar to the previous Conservative government as well. But the Labour Party are going to take different approaches to the previous government. So on net migration levels, whereas the Conservatives were sort of more trying to restrict the supply of visas, Labour are sort of taking it from the other approach and trying to restrict the demand for visas. And the way that they're going to do that is by trying to reduce the reliance of certain employers and industries on migrant labour. So sectors which request high numbers of visas are going to be tasked with putting in place workforce training plans, essentially to sort of train up and fill skills gaps using workers who are already in the UK, and in doing that mean that they don't need to turn towards migrant labour. Then when it comes to irregular migration, the sort of flagship policy here is sort of a border command, a border security command. And this would really sort of look at smashing the gangs, is the term that they use. Now, this isn't as much of a difference compared to the Conservative government. The Conservative government were also quite hot on enforcement, but I think it's going to be a different approach. The tricky thing when saying about how effective that might be is first, we don't sort of have some of the some more detailed aspects of this plan. Also, enforcement something of a black box, and so suggests the evidence that it can work quite effectively, but we don't know sort of which parts of enforcement work more effectively. So it can make it quite difficult to evaluate until we actually see what happens with figures.
Will the UK always need net migration? I accept the point that you're making that, trying to encourage industries to train up people is a way of perhaps reducing their reliance on migrant workers. But UK is an ageing population. Are they not going to need new workers to try and sustain economic growth? Another big goal of the government.
When it comes to the ageing population, it's not just about having sort of more people in the UK, because at its heart, the ageing population is a financial problem, that there are more people not working, drawing on pensions, using healthcare services. And so really, to the extent that migration is a part of the solution to that, it's about having migrants who contribute more to the public finances than they take out. Now, if we look at the data on public finances, we see that overall, migrants contribute about as much as they take out. The impacts are very, very small there, but there will be differences between different groups of migrants. So, for example, those who are in employment, and particularly those who are in higher paying roles, have a more positive contribution than those who aren't in the labour market, and those who have children as well, because education services can be quite expensive. So that's sort of the overall picture. Of course, that might be that there are vacancies in particular areas. So social care, for example, is one where there are currently quite high vacancy rates, and obviously as the population gets older, demand on social care services might increase. And so while overall it's not just about people in these specific areas, there might be skills gaps which need to be filled. But of course, it's not just migrant labour that can fill those gaps. There are workers in the UK that could work, for example, in the social care sector and fill gaps there too.
We've been talking about this almost like quite an academic debate, Ben, and we can just sort of tweak the system, calibrate the numbers and get the right approach. There is something that this is a big international problem. The UK is not the only country that faces this. And I think part of the frustration of the public is the government doesn't have control. Intrinsically, we can't control where people go around the world, right? There is an element to this which is irreducibly outside the government's control, right? How large is that?
That depends on which type of migration that we're talking about. So again, thinking about regular migration, it's easier to control sort of work and student migration compared to other types, such as family migration. There are going to be other policy aspects and other external factors which influence this. And in fact, if we look at the visa stats from today, we've seen that there's been a fall in international students coming to the UK. Now, that could be in part because of the ban on student dependence. At the same time, it could also be to do with external factors like the currency crisis in Nigeria, which makes UK universities considerably more expensive. So policy can have a role and likely has more influence in some areas, but it's also about external factors and about how immigration policy interacts with other areas of policy as well. Then when it comes to irregular migration, policy can play a bit of a role, but also it's about sort of big geopolitical factors, oppressive regimes or things like this that tend to have more influence than what, say, the UK is doing in terms of policy.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us and helping us to understand that new data we have out today. That's Ben Brindle there, researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.